One of the last great kings of the Neo-Assyrian Empire was Ashurbanipal, who ruled from 668 to around 630 BCE. If you were to judge him only from the relief sculptures on the walls of his palace, you'd see that he was a militaristic king who was preoccupied with battles and who filled his leisure hours by killing lions from a chariot. But he had another side as well. Unlike most Mesopotamian kings, Ashurbanipal was an intellectual, a man who could read and write, and who studied with the scholars at his court. He collected vast numbers of literary and religious works and organized them in a number of rooms in his palace at Nineveh, in the northern part of modern-day Iraq. This collection is considered to be one of the earliest libraries ever created. Since the documents were written on clay tablets, they survived for more than 2,500 years. When the library was rediscovered during the mid-19th century excavations, these same writings provided modern scholars with an extraordinary window into the intellectual world of the Neo-Assyrians. Ashurbanipal had included in his library a copy of a poem known as the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's considered to be a masterpiece of literature and the world's oldest epic poem. It was already more than 500 years old when Ashurbanipal's scribes wrote out the copy for his library. I'll come back to that in a moment. First, let's look at Ashurbanipal's library in more detail. Why was he so interested in the written word? It might have had something to do with his wife, Libali Sharat. We have a letter that was written to Libali Sharat before her husband became king. And though she might have found the letter annoying, it's fascinating for us. In it, her sister-in-law wrote, "Word of the king's daughter to Libali Sharat. Why don't you write your tablet and do your homework?" Here, one princess was scolding another for not writing her tablets and not doing her homework. This implies that it was expected that the royal princess would be literate. Yet it's a surprise, because we don't have a lot of evidence for literate women in Mesopotamian history. The fact that Libali Sharat could read and write might suggest that she had some influence on her husband, or perhaps he had influence over her. Either way, they were a literate royal couple, a very unusual thing. After his father died and Ashurbanipal became king in 668 BCE, he bragged about his wisdom. He wrote about all the types of study he had undertaken. "I learned the hidden secret, the whole of the scribal craft. I can discern celestial and terrestrial portents and deliberate in the assembly of the experts." He's saying that he could understand signs that were believed to come from the gods. He continued, "I am able to discuss the series, if the liver is a mirror image of the sky, with capable scholars." This was a scholarly text that listed liver omens and their interpretations, which he could analyze. Next, he said, "I can solve convoluted reciprocals and calculations that do not come out evenly." So he was trained in complicated mathematics. And "I have read cunningly written text in Sumerian, the interpretation of which is difficult." Sumerian was an ancient and dead language already by this time, but Ashurbanipal had studied and learned how to make sense of it. Finally, he said, "I have examined stone inscriptions from before the flood, which are sealed, stopped up, mixed up." The documents he had read were so ancient that he believed that they had been written before the mythical flood. This would be like someone today being able to read medieval manuscripts. It would have taken a lot of time and effort to learn. All of this tells us that Ashurbanipal was deeply interested in scholarly learning. And as a result, he was singularly focused on the creation of his library. Now, it wasn't what we think of as a library. People couldn't come in and borrow cuneiform tablets to read and study. Instead, it was a collection of written works for the king's use and for his court. Yet it didn't include much of what you would expect in a library, like works about history or current events or scientific discoveries. Still, the shelves of Ashurbanipal's library were lined with tablets representing the most advanced knowledge of the time, knowledge useful to the king. There were tablets with long lists of words used by scribes in school, and there were copies of royal inscriptions from the past. There were rituals and hymns, some of them in the dead language of Sumerian. There were texts describing medical conditions and the ways to treat them. And there were thousands of omen texts, which listed a particular unusual event or sign and explained what was supposedly going to happen as a result of that sign. Only a few of the texts were what we would recognize as literary, stories about heroes and gods. The discovery of Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh in the 1850s created front-page headlines once its contents began to be revealed. The two archaeologists who excavated there were Hormuzd Rassam and Austin Henry Layard. Rassam was born in Iraq and educated at Oxford. He later became the British Museum's Director of Mesopotamian Excavations. And Layard was a British lawyer, archaeologist, and diplomat. Nineveh was of great interest in the new field of archaeology because it had been the fourth and largest capital of Assyria. The religious capital of Ashur was the first. Then Ashurnazirpal II had moved the capital to Kalhu. Later, a king named Sargon built a big new capital city that he modestly called Fort Sargon, after himself. Around 700 BCE, Sargon's son moved the capital, this time to Nineveh, which is where it stayed for the rest of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, until 612 BCE. The British excavator, Layard, described the discovery of the library this way. He wrote, "To the height of a foot or more from the floor, the rooms were entirely filled with cuneiform documents, some entire, but the greater part broken into many fragments." Unfortunately, the archaeologists, Rassam and Layard, didn't really know what to do with so many cuneiform tablets. It was the first time that a really large collection of tablets had been uncovered, and the archaeologists didn't think to make notes of which ones were found in each location. So they put the tablets in boxes and shipped them back to the British Museum. In the process, the library tablets got mixed up with others that had been found in the palaces at Nineveh. Ever since, scholars have been trying to sort out the confusion, and it's very difficult. If the library had been excavated more recently, we'd have photographs of exactly where each fragment had been located when recovered, and we could see how the tablets had been originally organized. It does seem, though, that the library was spread across 4 different buildings on the citadel, 2 palaces and 2 temples. Once the tablets arrived in the British Museum, scholars set out to work on them, like a jigsaw puzzle, finding broken fragments that fit together and reconstructing the tablets. This continues. They also began to translate them. Cuneiform had only recently been deciphered, and there was a lot of interest in what was written on these tablets. There still is. One man who made a big contribution to this effort was a British Assyriologist named George Smith. He hadn't formally studied cuneiform or the Akkadian language. Actually, he didn't attend university at all. He was from a working-class family, and he left school young to become a banknote engraver. But he was a brilliant individual who was fascinated by cuneiform and taught himself how to read it. The British Museum brought him in to help work on the library tablets. In December 1872, about 20 years after Ashurbanipal's library was rediscovered, George Smith addressed the Society of Biblical Archaeology at the British Museum. He had astounding news. While working on mythological texts from Nineveh, he'd found 80 fragments from a single long poem written on 11 tablets. On tablet number 11, he discovered an account of a flood that was almost identical to the one in the Bible. A man was chosen by a god to survive a flood that wiped out almost all life. He was given instructions to build a boat and to load animals onto it. The floodwaters rose and the storm raged, but eventually the boat landed on a mountaintop. The man and his family survived, and they thanked the gods for their deliverance. This man's name was Utnapishtim, and the god who warned him about the flood was named Ea. But the similarities to the biblical story of Noah astounded everyone listening to Smith's talk. Newspapers around the world covered the story, and it was a great topic of conversation. Some people thought the Assyrian version confirmed the truth of the biblical tale. Others thought it raised more doubts. One London newspaper, The Telegraph, even decided to send Smith to Nineveh to search for more fragments of the flood story. Amazingly, he found them. I don't know of any other instance when an archaeologist wanted to find a particular piece of a text at a site and was able to do so. Think about it. 30,000 tablets and tablet fragments had been discovered at Nineveh during Layard's excavations, and only a handful of them came from the flood story. So the fact that Smith's later excavation recovered additional fragments of the flood tablet is almost unbelievable. But it's true. In Smith's book about this project, he notes that he started excavating at the palace on May 9th. And just 5 days later, his workmen uncovered what he was looking for. He wrote, "On cleaning one of the tablets, I found to my surprise and gratification that it contained the greater portion of 17 lines of the inscription, and fitting into the only place where there was a serious blank in the story. Now with this portion, I was enabled to make it nearly complete." Although the flood story got most of the press at the time, it was part of a remarkable poem that we call the Epic of Gilgamesh, which I mentioned earlier. The poem is very long. Modern translations cover at least 40 pages. It's also the best-known work of literature from Mesopotamia. We now have many more copies of it from other ancient sites. But it was first identified in the library at Nineveh. The author was a man named Sin-Leke-Unini, who lived around 1200 BCE. Like the later Greek poet Homer, who was, of course, said to have written down the Iliad and the Odyssey, Sin-Leke-Unini took legends that had been passed down orally, along with some earlier written versions of the epic, and he rewrote them and put them together into a literary masterpiece. His work was copied over and over again, and ended up in Ashurbanipal's library some 500 years later. Gilgamesh probably was a real king, who would have lived about 2,000 years before Ashurbanipal. I say probably because no evidence of him survives from his own time. But we know that some people mentioned with Gilgamesh in various tales were real, so he probably was too. The epic wasn't the only literary work to mention Gilgamesh, but already in older stories, he was something of a superhero. They said that he was victorious over not just human enemies, but monsters as well. He was thought to have had some divine blood. He even had conversations with gods. But he was still fundamentally seen as human. And to start with, his story had nothing to do with a flood. The Mesopotamians had told tales about a great flood, though, which they thought had happened tens of thousands of years in the past. The Mesopotamians' flood story was always similar to the one in the Bible, but in earlier versions, the hero of the tale didn't always have the same name. Sometimes he was Atrahasis. Sometimes he was Ziusudra. By the time the Epic of Gilgamesh was written, he was named Utnapishtim. Sin-Leke-Unini took the Gilgamesh stories and the flood story, and he combined them into a single epic. His hero, Gilgamesh, was haunted by one of the great human dilemmas. He realized that he was going to die, and he didn't want to. Gilgamesh also had plenty of flaws. He was brash and arrogant, and the people he ruled, in the city of Uruk in southern Mesopotamia, were tired of him. At the beginning of the story, the citizens of Uruk ask the gods for relief from his demands, and the gods comply. They create a man who would be a match for the king. His name is Enkidu. Enkidu starts out like a wild creature, apparently convinced that he's one of the animals of the steppe. But he's tamed by a prostitute who convinces him that he is a man, and she brings him to Uruk. After fighting to a draw with Gilgamesh, Enkidu becomes the king's close friend, and they go off together on further adventures. The two companions imagine that they will make names for themselves and gain immortality, and they decide to do this by defeating a ferocious creature named Humbaba. Sin-Leke-Unini wrote this speech for Gilgamesh. "I will conquer Humbaba in the forest of cedar. I will establish forever a name eternal." After a long battle, our heroes manage to defeat Humbaba. This makes the gods take notice. Gilgamesh even attracts the attentions of the goddess Ishtar, who was known for her passions. She was the goddess of both love and war. The poem continues. On the beauty of Gilgamesh, Lady Ishtar looked with longing. "Come, Gilgamesh, be you my bridegroom. Grant me your fruits, O grant me. Be you my husband, and I your wife." But Gilgamesh wasn't interested. He knows all about Ishtar's reputation for mistreating men, and he wants nothing to do with her. He calls her a shoe that bites the foot of its owner, and a lot of other nasty things. Ishtar is furious about Gilgamesh's rejection. She asks her father, the god Anu, to send a creature called the Bull of Heaven to punish Gilgamesh. But again, Gilgamesh and Enkidu prevail. They are able to kill the Bull of Heaven. They cut out its heart and take it to the sun god. Now Ishtar is even madder than before. Hopping and stamping, she wailed in woe, "Alas, Gilgamesh, who mocked me, has killed the Bull of Heaven." The two heroes have become too self-confident. Now, Sin Leke changes the mood of his story and shows how Gilgamesh and Enkidu will be punished for their hubris. Enkidu wakes up one morning and tells Gilgamesh about a disturbing dream he's had. It was a vision of the afterlife, which he describes as dull and unpleasant. It was, he says, the house which none who enters ever leaves, on the path that allows no journey back. People there had no light, they ate clay, and wore feathers like birds. Even former kings and priests were stuck there, with no special privileges. The Mesopotamians believed that dreams came from the gods, so clearly Enkidu has received a premonition of his own death. Sure enough, he grows weaker and sicker, and a few days later, he dies. Gilgamesh waits with the body for days, in disbelief, until a worm falls out of Enkidu's nose. Then he accepts that his friend is dead. Still, he mourns and wails for him. He walks around and around the body, and he tears out his hair and rips off his fine clothes. He's devastated. Enkidu is given an elaborate burial and lots of valuable grave goods. But something bigger is bothering Gilgamesh. If his dearest friend can die, then he faces the same fate. Tablet 9 of the epic finds Gilgamesh roaming around, disconsolate, and wondering what to do. He says, "I shall die, and shall I not be then as Enkidu? Sorrow has entered my heart. I am afraid of death, so I wander the wild." The gods aren't very reassuring. The sun god speaks to him directly, stating, "O Gilgamesh, where are you wandering? The life that you seek, you will never find." Still, Gilgamesh is undeterred. He has a plan. There's one mortal man he's heard of who has managed to live forever. If Gilgamesh can find this man, he will learn the secret of immortality. That man is Utnapishtim, the hero from the story of the flood. Eventually, a woman who's a tavern keeper and a man who ferries people on boats help Gilgamesh find the distant land where Utnapishtim lives with his wife. And here, at last, we come to Tablet 11 and the story of the flood. So although this had previously been a completely separate story, Sin Leke Unini now brings it into the epic as part of Gilgamesh's search for eternal life. And it does make sense. Gilgamesh disappears from the narrative at this point, and Utnapishtim becomes the storyteller. The flood tale is told in his words, all about how he survived in his boat. At the end, and this is quite unlike the story of Noah, the god who'd caused the flood in the first place decides to give eternal life to Utnapishtim and his wife. So Gilgamesh has heard this whole story, but how is it supposed to help him? Another flood isn't about to happen. Gilgamesh can't duplicate Utnapishtim's experience. In fact, he can't even stay awake for more than a day. Utnapishtim tests him, and Gilgamesh fails. If he can't keep sleep away, how can he possibly defeat death? Gilgamesh is disconsolate. After all that searching, he has nothing to show for it. He says to the central character of this epic narrative, "O Utnapishtim, what should I do and where should I go? A thief has taken hold of my flesh. For there in my bedchamber death does abide, and wherever I turn, there too will be death." Utnapishtim then presents Gilgamesh with an incredible gift. Directions for finding a plant that will make him young again, the plant of heartbeat. Gilgamesh dives into the ocean to get the plant. And then he says to the boatman, "I will eat it myself and be again as I was in my youth." You can feel his excitement. All is not lost. He can put off death for ages now. But Gilgamesh is careless. Before eating the plant, he leaves it by a pond while bathing. It's stolen by a snake, which sheds its skin and becomes young, while Gilgamesh is condemned to die just as before. And now, Sinleke Unini writes that Gilgamesh sat down and wept. This seems like a tragedy. The moral of the story seems to be that everyone will die. Even a hero who could kill divine monsters, even someone on speaking terms with the gods. But there is a note of optimism at the end. Gilgamesh says this to his boatman as they finally get home to Uruk. "Climb Uruk's wall and walk back and forth. Survey its foundations, examine the brickwork. Were its bricks not fired in an oven? Did the 7 sages not lay its foundations? A square mile is city, a square mile is date grove, a square mile is clay pit, half a square mile the temple of Ishtar, 3 square miles and a half is Uruk's expanse." This might not seem like an obvious happy ending, but Gilgamesh is describing the city he rules, and apparently with pride. His city was founded by the gods, and it was a wonder to behold, 3.5 square miles in extent and made of baked bricks. In Gilgamesh's time, it was the largest and most modern city on the planet. In making this speech, Gilgamesh seems to have reconciled himself to his earthly and mortal existence as a king of an impressive kingdom. He can stop wandering the earth looking for immortality. There is so much in this epic tale that is really quite profound. And even hundreds of years before Sinleke Unini set down these words, the story of Gilgamesh was already a deeply thoughtful meditation on life and death. As seen in Enkidu's dream, the Mesopotamians didn't have any heaven to look forward to. The afterlife was dull and endless for everyone. In believing this, they were like most ancient peoples. But they still believed in their gods because there was no other option. Religion didn't include a heavenly reward at that time. It was all about serving the gods and being rewarded in this life. So Gilgamesh's quest for immortality would have resonated with his audience. And the ultimate message was one of hope. In a version from the Old Babylonian period, at least 500 years earlier, the innkeeper gives a lovely speech that supplies one lesson of the tale. The innkeeper tells Gilgamesh, "The life that you seek, you will never find. When the gods created mankind, death they dispensed to mankind, life they kept for themselves. But you, Gilgamesh, let your belly be full. Enjoy yourself always by day and by night. Make merry each day, dance and play day and night. Let your clothes be clean, let your head be washed, may you bathe in water. Gaze on the child who holds your hand. Let your wife enjoy your repeated embrace, for such is the destiny of mortal men." Of course, Gilgamesh ignores her advice and goes on searching for Utnapishtim, but this speech strikes me as instructive. The tavern keeper doesn't tell him to be kingly or to go and fight enemies. She tells him to enjoy his wife and child, eat well, and be merry. This advice would apply to anyone, not just to a king. It seems to have been a common Mesopotamian belief that you only live once, so seize the day and enjoy what you have, rather than trying to attain privileges that are reserved for the gods, like eternal life. Textbooks often tell us that the Mesopotamians were depressed, anxious, pessimistic people, but I don't buy it. For one thing, you can't stereotype a whole population like that, whether they're ancient or modern. And when you read the many different documents written in Mesopotamia, you see that, for the most part, they followed the innkeeper's advice to enjoy life. Perhaps their dismal view of the afterlife made them appreciate living all the more. The Epic of Gilgamesh has many other themes as well, like the importance of friendship and not upsetting the gods, and the idea that pride comes before a fall. This tale was very popular and was translated into other ancient languages. Fragments of it have been found at a number of sites across the Near East. King Ashurbanipal kept more than one copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh in his library, but most of the library texts were more practical. The majority of them were records of omens and divination. So when almost anything happened in the night sky, such as an eclipse of the moon or the appearance of a planet in a particular constellation, scholars consulted the omen texts to find out what this portended. By the time of Ashurbanipal, priests had kept accurate diaries of the movements of the planets and stars for about a century. They were even able to predict when eclipses would take place, though not where they would be observed, and where the planets would appear in the sky. But even then, the Mesopotamians believed that the gods were sending messages that way. If the king wanted an answer to a particular question, he could ask his diviners to practice extispicy. This was figuring out the will of the gods by reading the internal organs of sacrificed sheep and goats. The shape of the liver of the sacrificed animal was thought to be particularly useful. Each bump and depression and deformation of the liver was thought to have meaning that could be interpreted by the diviner. I've been told that in mammals, the liver has more variation than any other organ, so perhaps that made it a particularly good way to ascertain the messages that the gods wanted to send. The diviners of Mesopotamia couldn't just make things up. Their discoveries were believed to be predictable and scientific. They had to look up old reference books, reference tablets, to find out what had happened in the past when the same signs had been observed. Priests and officials often cited omens and oracles when they wrote to the king. It's quite possible that they consulted the royal library when they did so. Some tablets in the library had belonged to King Ashurbanipal's father and grandfather. Others were copied in Nineveh by scribes employed by Ashurbanipal himself. And some were copied from tablets seized in Babylonia, or they were written by Babylonian scribes who had been captured and forced to work in the king's library. Ashurbanipal also commissioned scribes in other cities to copy texts and send them to him. So the Assyrians were interested in big questions of human existence, and they systematically collected and organized knowledge and made accurate astronomical observations. Their endeavors moved people a step closer to what we now know as philosophy and science. As king, Ashurbanipal seems to have been determined to have access to as much written knowledge as he possibly could, even while he also tried to rule according to the wishes of the gods.